George Muller, The Guardians of Bristol's Orphans, by Janet and Geoff Benge. God had given me a mission field right here, and I will live and die in it. George Muller stared at a beggar girl. She was no older than 5 and was piggybacking her little brother. Her mother had died in the cholera epidemic sweeping England. Chapter 1. A Common Thief. Crash! A water pot toppled over onto the sidewalk beneath George Muller as he stretched his foot out to reach the ground. George was climbing out of the back window of an inn where he had been staying, and when he heard the crash, he froze. After he was satisfied no one had heard him, he lowered one foot softly onto the cobbled pavement, then the other. 16-year-old George pulled his tall, lanky body up to its full height and looked around. Good, he muttered to himself under his breath. I'm safe. Now to get out of here. A moment later, George realized he'd spoken too soon. Police officers appeared at the end of the street and began running towards George. He swung around, desperately looking for some way to escape, but there was none. Before he knew it, the strong hands of the policeman had grabbed his arm and were dragging him roughly along the cobblestone street in the direction of the jail. An hour later, George was waiting for his name to be called. The backless wooden bench he sat on was hard and uncomfortable, and the chains around his slender wrists and ankles bit at his flesh. As he waited, George thought about how shocked his father would be to see him in shackles. Then again, his father probably wouldn't be any more shocked than George was right then. George had done dishonest things many times before, but this was the first time he'd been caught. That is, the first time he had been caught by the police. When he was 10, his father had caught him, and it turned out to be a painful and humiliating experience. His father, Johann Muller, was a tax collector for the Prussian government, and he often left large sums of money in the house. Mr. Muller often complained that small amounts of his money were missing, but George, like his younger brother, passionately declared he knew nothing about it. One day, George was called to his father's office, where his father had laid a trap for him. Mr. Muller had counted out a number of coins and left them on the corner of his desk. When George arrived at the office, his father pretended he needed to go into another room. Alone in the office, George saw the pile of coins on his father's desk and thought of all the wonderful things he could do with the money. It seemed such a shame to put all the coins into the official black leather pouch his father used for collecting tax money and hand the money over to some government official. So George crept up to the desk and quietly lifted 3 coins from the top of the pile. Who would miss them? George quickly dropped the coins inside his right sock. When Johann Muller returned to his office, much to George's dismay, he looked straight at the pile of coins. How strange, he said in a low, constrained voice George had come to fear. I thought there were more coins than that. Let me count them. George could feel his cheeks becoming hot and flushed. His heart began to race. The cold coins pressed against his ankle inside his sock. Empty your pockets, said Mr. Muller evenly, looking his son in the eye. But, Papa, George began, then thought better of it. Obediently, he emptied his pockets onto the desk. There were a quill nib, 3 glass marbles, and a foot-long piece of string. George turned his pockets inside out so that his father could see that they were empty. Now take off your shirt. George was horrified. How far would his father go before he believed his oldest son? And your pants. George began to fret. Things were not looking good. If his father found the coins in his sock, George would be beaten. and from previous experience, George knew that a boy without his pants on made an especially good target. "Now your socks," continued his father in a determined voice. George inched them off his feet, first the left and then the right, being careful to gather the coins in such a way that they would not clink together. "Hand them over," demanded his father. George's heart raced even faster. His face felt like it was on fire now. George lowered his eyes as he gave the socks to his father. A second later, his father exploded. "My son, a common thief! How dare you disgrace the name of Muller? Come here now." He reached for the cane that stood propped in the corner of his office. Crack, crack, crack. The caning seemed to go on forever. The pain was excruciating. Eventually, George felt his legs begin to buckle under him, just as his father's temper subsided and the punishment came to an end. "Don't ever steal again, do you hear me?" said Johann Muller, shaking his son's shoulders to emphasize each word. Yes, stuttered George. "Now get out of my sight," roared his father, pointing at the door. George gathered his clothes and half walked, half crawled to the door, not even stopping to dress. Right then, he didn't care much who saw him. His bottom was throbbing too much. He made his way up to his second-floor bedroom, where he locked the door behind him. Safe inside, he collapsed onto the bed and began to sob his heart out. "As long as I live, I'll never do that again," he promised himself between sobs, at the same time running his fingers over the welts on his legs and buttocks. George wasn't promising himself that he wouldn't steal again. No, he loved the thrill and adventure of stealing too much for that, not to mention its rewards. What George Muller promised himself was that he would never again get caught. Stealing was exciting, but getting caught was painful and humiliating. Now, 6 years later, he had allowed himself to get caught again. How could he have been so stupid? He asked himself the question over and over as he sat on the hard wooden bench in the police station. "You," a police officer said, pointing at George. "Come here, and hurry up about it." Yes, sir," George replied, getting to his feet as best he could, with the chains wrapped around him. As he shuffled over to the desk, he held his head up and tried to look like an obedient young man who had been wrongly accused. "Name?" asked the police officer. "Muller, sir. George Muller." The police officer wrote it down in a huge leather-bound book. "Date and place of birth?" he asked, when he had finished writing. "September 27th, 1805, in Kroppenstadt, Prussia." The police officer began writing in the book. He stopped only to redip his quill pen in a bottle of India ink. As he watched, George wondered how much the police actually knew. Did they know he had spent a week in an inn in Brunswick and left there without paying before coming to Wolfensbüttel? If they didn't know, George determined to keep his wits about him and not to give away any more information than he absolutely had to. After 3 hours of relentless questioning, though, he confessed to all his crimes. Yes, he had spent a week in an expensive inn in Brunswick and left there without paying the bill. Yes, he was trying to do the same thing in Wolfensbüttel by escaping through the window of the inn. No, he did not have the money to pay for the rooms, and no, he could not think of one good reason why he should not be sent to jail to await trial. The next day, George sat in his cell, humming a Christmas carol. It was Christmas Day, but what did that matter now? George had spent the previous 5 Christmases at the Cathedral Classic School in Halfenstadt, where he had studied Latin, French, and German classes, and arithmetic. Everything had been so simple there. His teachers were so easy to fool. From the time he was 12 years old, he had been able to escape school at night and go to beer-drinking parties, card games, and local entertainment houses to play the piano and the guitar. After graduating, instead of going home, George had decided to take a short trip. And that's how his present trouble had started. He had written his father that he had been asked to stay 2 weeks longer at school to sing at a special church service. Then he had hit the road without any money to tour Lower Saxony, which in turn had landed him in jail. How could he have been so stupid? He had plenty of time to think about that answer. Days went by, and the only thing he had to look forward to was the black bread and salty vegetable gruel he was fed twice a day. By the time he'd been in the cell a week, he knew every inch of it. From the initials TW carved in the stone above his bed, to the groove in the wall that ran parallel to the bars in the window, to the nail on the middle hinge of the thick wooden door that was shinier than the others. George also wondered whether his father had received a letter from the authorities informing him where his son was. George kept count of the days he'd been in jail by scratching a mark on the wall each time the early morning sunlight crept through the cell door. It was January 16th. He had now been imprisoned for 24 days. For all he knew, he would be there another 24, or even 224 days. At mid-morning, he heard a promising sound. Keys jangled in the lock, and his cell door creaked open. 2 policemen walked in and yanked George to his feet. "Your father has come to get you out. I wouldn't say you're free, though." As the policeman laughed at his joke, George groaned. His father would be in a terrible mood. And he was. He paid George's debt to the 2 innkeepers and another sum to cover the cost of George's keep while he was in jail. George was then released into his father's care. As father and son climbed into a horse-drawn coach for the journey home, Johann Muller hissed at George. "What would your mother think of her oldest son? Answer me that!" For the rest of the trip, he sat in stony silence. George couldn't answer the question. His mother had died suddenly 2 years before, but he'd been so busy with his friends he hardly missed her. He wished he'd felt bad about disappointing her and disappointing his father, but he didn't. He was just sorry he had been caught. He was also sorry about what was going to happen when they arrived home. After traveling all day, the coach pulled to a halt in front of the Muller home. George climbed out, trying to control his trembling hands. As he walked inside, his father pointed to his office. George's shoulders slumped. George had expected the worst, and sure enough, he received the longest and hardest beating he had ever endured. It was days before he could walk properly again. About a week later, Johann Muller called his son into his office and told him it was time to grow up and make something of himself. To that end, he had enrolled George into the University of Halle. George's heart skipped a beat. That was exactly where he had dreamed of going. But his father was not finished. Yes, George would be going to Halle, one of the best universities in Europe, to study the classics. But his father had arranged for him to have a personal tutor while he was there. This tutor, whom Mr. Muller had already selected, would stick to George like glue. George would report to him before and after every class, and the tutor would study with George each evening and on the weekends. He would also send a weekly report home on George's progress. George could hardly believe it. A tutor! How could his father do this to him? It would be as bad as if he was in jail. All the other young men would be out enjoying themselves, and he would be stuck in his room studying. There had to be some way around it. There was. But it involved a lot of lying and scheming. George decided it was unthinkable to go to the University of Halle with a personal tutor. So, without his father's knowledge, he made a secret trip to the town of Nordhausen, where he applied to a smaller pre-university school. Since he had always made good grades, no matter how little he studied, he was quickly accepted into the school. Then he began wondering how he would tell his father of his plans. Each night, as he lay in bed, George promised himself that tomorrow would be the right time to break the news. But when tomorrow came, something always seemed to get in the way. The months rolled by. The morning of September 30th dawned, the day before George was due to leave for the University of Halle. George took a deep breath. It was now or never. Johann Muller was furious when he heard the news. When would the lies end? How could George turn down an opportunity like Halle for some little pre-university school? The questions went on and on, but in the end, George's father could see it was no use. George was now 17 years old and couldn't be made to study anywhere he did not want to. Reluctantly, Johann Muller gave permission for his son to attend school at Nordhausen, pointing out that George was bound to regret his decision. George Muller loved living in Nordhausen, one of the oldest cities in Prussia, tucked up against the edge of the lower slopes of the Harz Mountains. In his spare time, George liked nothing better than to walk through the town and into the beautiful valley below. But he did not have much spare time. He had promised himself he would study hard, and that's exactly what he did. Most days he rose at 4 in the morning and did schoolwork all day until 10 at night, when he fell into bed exhausted. That was most of the time, but occasionally, though, he took a night off, and that's when he started to get into trouble. It was the gambling and partying, again, two activities that cost a lot of money. His father provided him a small allowance, but George was able to spend it 10 times faster than he received it. By the middle of the first year, George was desperate for money. He owed money to the tavern owner, the haberdasher, with whom he played cards, and several of his friends. He had come up with a plan to quickly get more money. Just then, the allowance from his father arrived and gave him a wonderful idea, which he put into immediate action. George made a big fuss over the money he had just received, making sure that many people in the school knew it had arrived in the mail. Then he sneaked into his dormitory room and hid the money in the false bottom of his trunk. Next, he took a hammer and smashed the lock on the trunk, as well as the one on his guitar case. Then he grabbed his coat and went for a walk. Throughout the walk, he practiced what he would say, and by the time he got back to school, he had everything rehearsed perfectly. He strolled in through the front door, commenting on the pleasant weather to some of the other students. As he took off his coat, he then walked into his room, looked at the broken lock on his trunk, and yelled. Young men came running to see what had happened. "My money!" George yelled, enjoying himself immensely. "My money's gone! Someone's broke into my trunk and stolen it!" He looked at the shocked faces of his friends. "What am I going to do now?" he wailed. "Don't worry, George. We'll work something out," said one friend. "Yes, he'll be all right," said another friend, patting George kindly on the shoulder. "I wonder who would do such a thing?" asked a third friend. But any attempt to answer the question was lost in a wave of sympathy. George smiled to himself. The plan was going better than he had hoped. Over the next several days, George's friends took up a collection for him, and when they presented it to him, it added up to more than the amount he had actually lost. The people he owed money to were also kind and extended the length of their loans. By the time the plan had run its course, George had more than twice as much money as his father had sent him, and he didn't have to pay off his creditors right away. George congratulated himself on outsmarting everyone, and he didn't have the slightest tinge of regret about what he had done. There was nothing to regret. It was all a game. In the next 2 years George spent at the school in Nordhausen, no one ever found out what he had done, or any other dishonest thing he had done. He had covered his tracks so well. When George's time at Nordhausen was nearly over, Johann Muller sent for George to discuss his future. Mr. Muller announced that he wanted George to become a Lutheran pastor. The Lutheran Church was the official state church of Prussia. Lutheran pastors were well paid and well respected. When George learned that his father was preparing to pay for him to attend Halle University to earn his degree, he quickly agreed to enroll. This time there would be no personal tutor. George Muller couldn't be happier. He was going to the University of Halle after all. He was also on his way to becoming a Lutheran pastor, a person of high standing in the Prussian society. Goodness knows what tricks he could play on an entire congregation of kind, gullible people. Chapter 2: The Life of the Party. George was a little worried. For an hour and a half now, he'd listened to the University of Halle's provost talk about what it meant to be a divinity student. And quite frankly, it sounded rather grim. To be called as pastor to a good, well-paying church, a student had to have both excellent grades, especially in theology, and excellent conduct. A student who does not show the proper decorum, the provost had droned, his brow knotted into a permanent frown, will find himself in some tiny rural church with a meager income and no appropriate social circle. The mention of the meager income scared George the most. No matter how George and his father fought, Johann Muller had always given his son an ample allowance. Of course, that would end when George graduated and would be responsible for his own financial affairs. That was when he was going to need a good, well-paying church employing him. George shifted in his seat. His new vest was itching him terribly. With the provost still rambling on, George thought about the outward changes he would need to make for people to believe he was a good candidate to be a Lutheran pastor. First, he would need to purchase a Bible. He had over 300 books with him, probably more books than any other student in the university, but he did not have a Bible. He would also have to attend church at least every other week. He sighed, but he had no choice. What congregation, after all, would ask a person to be their pastor who went to church no more than 3 times a year? Finally, the provost finished his speech, and everyone rose to sing a final hymn. As George emerged from the dingy coolness of the stone chapel into the bright spring sunlight, he told himself maybe it was time to grow up a little. Partying and playing cards took up a lot of time and money. It was time now for him to stop indulging in such things and throw himself into serious study, especially if he wanted to land a good church that would pay him a not-so-meager salary. With this thought in mind, George wandered off to his room to unpack. George's good intentions lasted for about 2 weeks, right up to the time a new friend, Gunter, invited him to Der Grunger Tisch, the wildest ale house in Halle. "Don't tell me you're too busy to have a little fun," Gunter goaded him. George put down his book and looked up at Gunter. He hadn't had a drink of beer, heard a good story, or played a round of cards since arriving at the university. He was getting all his studies done, but What was the use of working so hard without a little excitement? "You know what? You're right, Gunter," said George, slamming his book shut. "Even a divinity student needs to live a little." Grabbing his coat, he followed his friend out into the mild April spring. It wasn't until George was breathing the smoky air, winking at the barmaids, and playing round after round of cards that he realized just how much he had missed it all. This was the life for him. As he gulped his beer, he promised himself that while he was partying in the evenings, he would keep up his grades during the daytime. Later, when he was closer to graduating, he would worry about being a more suitable candidate for a pastor. After all, he had plenty of time to improve. He was only 19 years old. George's reputation soon spread. Everyone at Hale heard about the clever divinity student who could guzzle 10 pints of beer in a single sitting, who could tell the most outrageous stories, including one about being thrown into jail, and always was ready to gamble. George became so popular that he found himself enjoying Hale more than he'd imagined he ever would, except for one thing: the old problem of debt. He'd lost a few games of cards and paid for a few rounds of drinks at Der Grunger's Tisch, and now owed money again. He pawned the watch his father had given him at confirmation, then his towels, sheets, and even some of his clothes. He intended to reclaim it all just as soon as he had his big win at the cards. The cards did not fall his way, however, and George began borrowing money, just as he did at Nordhausen. As George strolled along the river Saale one afternoon, feeling a little depressed about being in debt again, he decided he really had to do something about his life. But what? It was so hard trying to change, especially when the alehouse was the most exciting place in the entire town, and a young man was entitled to a little excitement. Before he knew it, he was turning the corner and slipping into the door at Der Grunger Tisch. "Ha! Come here, George Muller," he heard Gunter yell over the hubbub in the room. "If there's one thing I know that will liven up any party, it's my friend George." George grinned, bought himself a pint of beer, and made his way over to the table. Gunter continued the introduction. "This is Herr George Muller, the only divinity student I know who spent Christmas in jail. Come on, George. There's some new people here tonight. Tell us all about it." With great gusto, George launched into his story. He described the way he had tricked the first innkeeper and the look on the face of the policeman as he grabbed George. It all seemed so funny now, and George reveled in revealing and embellishing the story with each telling. As he spoke, he glanced around the listening crowd. Gunter was right. There were some faces he had never seen before. Through the smoky haze, though, the man sitting at the far end of the table looked vaguely familiar. "Well told," laughed Gunter, slapping George heartily on the back when he had finished the story. "I'll get you another beer, and then I want you to tell the story of when you broke into the pawn shop and retrieved your trunk." "Oh, yes. Get me a beer, and I'll tell you another story," agreed George, happily to be the center of attention. As the group around the table laughed among themselves, George noticed the man at the far end get up and walk toward him. "Yes," he frowned, "I've seen him before, but where?" "Betta's the name," said the man, thrusting his hand out to shake George's. "I don't suppose you remember me, though I remember you well." George reached back into his memory. Betta, Betta. Then it came to him. "Ah, Betta! How good to see you! Of course I remember you, from Cathedral Classic School in Halberstadt. You were the one who always carried the Bible and went to prayer meetings." Betta turned red. "Yes," he stammered, "but I've decided to live a little now that I'm at Hale. Can we be friends?" George wasn't sure it was a good idea. On one hand, he felt a strange rush of hope, seeing the religious Beta again. For just a second, he even thought Beta might be able to help him get out of the mess he was in. On the other hand, the last thing he wanted was to be seen with a religious do-gooder. From the way Beta sounded, it seemed like he might want to put those days behind him. "Let's see what happens," George said non-committally, at the same time moving over to make room for Gunter. The night finished like so many others, with George helping a few of his very drunk friends find their way back to their rooms. But as he did so, tonight, Beta followed along behind him, chattering away about their time at Halberstad. "He's very eager to be friends," thought George, as he steadied Gunter, who was staggering along beside him. "I guess there's no harm in letting him tag along with us." Soon the semester was nearly over, and the summer holidays were just around the corner. George pondered the question of what to do for them. Going back to visit his father seemed like a bad idea, and he'd had enough of Hale for a while. What he needed was some fresh air and a change of scenery. What he needed was a trip to Switzerland. "Switzerland?" said Beta incredulously. "How can we afford to go to Switzerland?" George smiled. "You worry too much," he scolded his friend. "Trust me, I have a plan. I always do." "Once our exams are over, we won't need our books until next year, will we?" Beta nodded in agreement. "Well, instead of letting them lie around in our rooms, let's pawn them and use the money for our trip. When we get back, we can use our first installment of allowance money to get them back. Now, doesn't that sound like a plan?" "Well," Beta's voice trailed off, "I guess it could work, as long as I knew we could get our books back." "Of course we can, trust me," replied George, as if the matter were already settled. "But what about passports? I'm underage, and so are you. Our fathers will have to sign for us." "You are too honest for your own good, Beta," laughed George. "You told me you were leaving all that religious stuff behind. Sometimes we just have to get a little creative." "How?" Beta asked. George took a deep breath. "How many pieces of paper do you have your father's signature on them?" he asked. "Maybe 2 or 3, replied Beta, looking puzzled. "How hard is it to practice until you can write your father's signature just like he does?" A broad smile lit up Beta's face. Finally, he was beginning to understand. "You mean forge my father's signature?" he asked. George nodded. "You can tell you've never thought of doing that before," he goaded. "Well, what a good idea," Beta stammered. Then, sounding more confident, he added, "I'm sure that won't be hard to do at all." And it wasn't. On August 28th, 1825, 5 young men set out from Hale for Switzerland. Each of them sported a new Prussian passport in his coat pocket, and the other 4 had handed George a pouch of gold coins. George had offered to keep track of all their expenses on the trip. The men had a great time. They traveled by horse-drawn coach through Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Zurich, right into the heart of Switzerland. They slept out in the open fields, climbed tall mountains, swam the glacier lakes, and entertained the local people in the village alehouse that they frequented on the way. After a month, the weather began to cool, and it was time for them to begin the journey back to Hale for the fall semester. As they traveled back through Bavaria and into southern Prussia, everyone congratulated George and Beta on their wonderful idea. As much fun as everyone else had, George was sure he'd enjoyed the trip the most. That was because he had paid only half as much as the other 4 companions. Helping yourself every so often along the way to a few coins from the combined purse was one of the advantages of being in charge of the money, George rationalized. Besides, If his friends were too stupid to ask questions about how much things cost, they deserved to be swindled. When they finally arrived back at Hale, George was the only one with enough money to redeem his books from the pawnshop right away. Yes, he smiled to himself as he walked back to his room with his new books. It had been a great trip, and profitable too. He wondered where they would go next year. By November, life had settled back into a familiar routine for George Muller. George studied hard during the day and partied and gambled by night. During the afternoon of November 20th, as George studied hard in his room, Betta dropped by to visit. "How about a walk?" he asked. "It stopped snowing and the paths have been cleared." George looked up from his English textbook. A walk did seem like a good idea. It might help clear his head. Betta patiently waited for George to finish reading the page he was on, and then pulled on his overcoat. The two of them headed outside and began walking toward the river. "I wonder if Otto will be at Der Grunger's Tisch tonight. He tells great stories about the days of the army, doesn't he?" said George as they walked side by side. Betta nodded. "Yes, he does, but I won't be going along tonight. I have something else to do." "Something else?" mocked George. "Something more important than a drink with your friends? And what might that be?" Betta looked away. "I've met another old friend," he said. "Anyone I know?" inquired George. "It's Herr Kaiser. I don't think you know him," Betta replied. "Well, how do you know this Herr Kaiser?" Betta began fiddling with his fringe of his scarf. "Well, he began, then stopped. Then he blurted, 'I'm going to a Bible meeting, and he's going to be running it.'" "A Bible meeting?" laughed George out loud. "Betta, I thought you had left all that behind when you met me." "I just wanted to have some fun. I never said I was giving it all up completely," Betta said lamely. "Well, you have turned religious on me again, haven't you? What do you do at these meetings?" "Nothing you'd be interested in," Betta replied. "We sing, we pray, and Herr Kaiser reads a sermon. It's not that bad, really. I think you'd even like Herr Kaiser if you met him." A scene flashed through George's mind. George was at Der Grunger's Tisch, telling his latest and funniest story yet about the night he'd gone with Betta to a Bible meeting. "I will meet Herr Kaiser," said George, turning to his friend. "Tonight, with you." Betta's face turned as white as the snow they were trudging through. "No, I don't think you should. I mean, you don't have to," he said, stumbling over his words. "Nonsense, Betta. You always come with me to the alehouse. The least I can do is go to a Bible meeting with you," George said mockingly, enjoying his friend's discomfort. George and Betta continued the rest of the walk in silence. As the snow crunched under his feet, George wondered what he had agreed to. It was fun to see Betta so worried, but was it worth his time going to a Bible meeting? He had heard about them. Sometimes people even got arrested at them for delivering sermons. It was against the law in Prussia to give a sermon without a registered Lutheran pastor present. This was supposed to ensure that only university-trained pastors got to preach, which kept the Bible from being distorted and uneducated peasants from getting strange ideas. At least that is what George had always been told. According to Betta, however, Herr Kaiser was going to read the sermon. That was how people got around the law. As long as the sermon had originally been written by a licensed and trained pastor, it could be read at any gathering. That got George wondering about what kind of man would want to read someone else's sermon. And more important, what was George getting himself into by going to the Bible meeting to hear someone else's sermon being read? Chapter 3. Something was strangely different. A tall, burly, blond man reached out to take George's coat. "I am Herr Wagner. Welcome to my home," he said. George mumbled something in reply. He was already beginning to regret coming. Perhaps the fresh supply of stories he had hoped to garner by attending the Bible meeting wasn't such a good idea after all. "You look chilled to the bone, Herr Muller. I suggest you stand by the fire for a few moments and warm yourself before the meeting starts," continued Herr Wagner kindly. George followed Betta into the large library, where 12 men and women were already seated in a semicircle around a blazing fire. Betta motioned toward a seat near the door, and George was glad to slip into it. He had never felt so out of place in his life. Soon a hymn book was thrust into his hand, and George sang along with the others, relieved that at least he recognized the tune of the song. While he sang, he relaxed a little and looked around the room. As he glanced to his left, a pair of the prettiest blue eyes he'd ever seen met his. George flushed a little and quickly returned his gaze to the words of the song in the hymnal. Then the group sang another hymn, then another. When they finally stopped singing, one of the men, Betta whispered to George that it was Herr Kaiser, knelt beside his chair. "Let us bow our heads to pray," he began. George was stunned. He could not take his eyes off of Herr Kaiser. In his entire life, he had never seen a person kneel to pray. And not only was Herr Kaiser kneeling to pray, but he was doing so in a room filled with people. George had always thought that people prayed and sang and taught the Bible the way he had always heard and seen it done at school and university. But that was not true. Herr Kaiser was praying to the same God, but in a totally different way than George had expected. George wondered what else might be different. Before long, he found out. After a long prayer, Herr Kaiser got to his feet, then sat down heavily. He picked up and opened a black leather-bound Bible. He began to read, first a verse, then 2, then 10, finally a whole chapter. George looked around. Everyone in the room was concentrating on what was being read. Several people even nodded in agreement or smiling at certain verses as they were read. Once the Bible reading was over, Herr Kaiser pulled out some sheets of paper from the folder on the table beside him, slanted them toward the oil lamp, and began to read the sermon. George had heard sermons before, at confirmation, at his mother's funeral, and on those few occasions when he had managed to get up early enough on Sunday to make it to church. But he had never heard a sermon like this one. It wasn't so much the words, but the way they were spoken. Even though Herr Kaiser was reading the sermon, he spoke as if every word was important. No, more than important, vital. George felt himself being drawn into what was being read. When Herr Kaiser finished reading, George pulled out his watch to check the time. He was surprised to find that an hour and a half had slipped by. The group sang another hymn, and Herr Wagner announced that it was time for the final prayer. "Dear Heavenly Father," he began, "we ask you to forgive us of all our unbelief and to strengthen us to do your will, trying in all things to honor you and the work of your beloved Son, Jesus Christ. Amen." Once again, George was amazed. It sounded as if Herr Wagner was talking to someone in the room. George sat in his chair for several minutes after the Amen, thinking about it. He was stunned by the whole evening. It was not at all like he had imagined it would be. Betta had told him that Herr Wagner had never been to university. Yet, for all that, George mumbled to himself, he prays a better prayer than me, and I'm a divinity student. What did you say? Asked Betta, his voice breaking into George's thoughts. Oh, nothing, said George. But it was something. These people sang as if they were singing about someone they knew. They prayed as if they were praying to someone in the room. And they preached as if they believed every word they said. It was all very troubling to George. Are you ready to go? Or should we ask if we could spend the night? Joked Betta. George looked around, startled to notice that only a couple people were still in the room. One of them was the young woman who had been staring at him during the singing of the first hymn. Now she walked boldly over to him. Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend, Betta? She asked in a lilting voice. Yes, of course, replied Betta. Ermengarde, I would like you to meet a college friend of mine, George Muller. George bowed, and Ermengarde nodded, causing her ringlets to bounce around the edges of her face. I hope we shall be seeing more of you, Herr Muller, she said, looking coyly into his eyes. Yes, yes, said George, desperately looking for a way out. He was not used to talking to women unless he was at the alehouse, half drunk. We must be off, George, said Betta, rescuing him. George put on his coat, scarf, and gloves, and followed Betta out into the cold, snowy night. The two men silently trotted alongside each other as they made their way back to the university. Finally, Betta broke the silence. Well, what did you think of the meeting? George could have come up with a funny reply, but for once he felt serious. He answered truthfully, Nothing I have ever done, not traveling to Switzerland, not spending the night drinking and partying in Der Gunther Tisch, has ever been anything as enjoyable to me as this evening was. Well, then you must come back with me tomorrow. They're having another meeting, said Betta, with a look of an amazement in his eyes. George did go back the next day, and the day after that too. Before the week was over, George Muller was kneeling beside his bed, asking God to forgive him his sins so that he could become a true Christian. All of this was an abrupt about-face for George. Many of his friends from Der Gunther Tisch found it impossible to believe it was not some elaborate trick. But as the days went by, even they had to admit that something was strangely different about George. He certainly wasn't the old George Muller they had spent so many nights at the alehouse with. This George didn't want to drink beer with them anymore. He didn't want to go to parties. He didn't want to borrow money. He didn't even want to tell the funny stories about his narrow escapes. All he seemed to want to do now was read the new Bible he had bought for himself and ask people questions about God and what it was all about. And he was always going off to those strange meetings where people read sermons when it wasn't even Sunday. George's friends were revolted by the change. George was acting worse than any divinity student they knew, and they made sure to tell him so. But their remarks had no effect. George had found the most exciting thing in the world, and he wasn't going to give it up for anyone. Of course, meeting Ermengarde each meeting he attended was an added bonus. George came to look forward to her flattering talk and dazzling smile. It took George only 6 weeks of going to the meetings and reading his Bible to come to a remarkable conclusion, one that would define the rest of his life. He concluded that he should be a missionary. It was all very clear to him. There were people in the world who had never heard of God, Jesus Christ, or the gospel message, and George Muller was going to search them out and tell them the good news. Once he'd made his decision, he couldn't wait to tell Ermengarde. Since Ermengarde had attended the same meetings as he reasoned that she would surely share the same goal, The couple found a few moments together after the meeting on the following Saturday. Ermengarde patted the seat beside her at the harpsichord. "Come sit down here, George. I want to hear you play a hymn," she said coyly. "I don't want to play a hymn right now, Ermengarde," he replied. "I have something to talk to you about." George sat down beside her and held her hand. "Ermengarde, I have decided to become a missionary," he said, relieved to finally have his plan out in the open. Ermengarde gasped. "Why, George, whatever made you come up with this ridiculous idea? I could never be a missionary's wife." Her face turned bright red as she realized what she had said. George had not officially asked her yet. There was a long moment of silence. George was the first to break it. "Well, I think you would make a very good missionary's wife. We could learn together, don't you think?" he asked hopefully. Ermengarde turned up her nose. "You can't be serious. I could never be a missionary. Missionaries are poor. They wear drab clothes and ride in carriages I would never be caught dead in. I'm sorry, George Muller, but it's the mission field or me. I would gladly be your wife, but I would never be the wife of a missionary. You have a good mind. Be a lawyer or a doctor, and leave being a missionary for other people who don't have anything better to do." With that, she stood up and stomped out of the room. George went home that night, feeling very dejected. He liked Ermengarde. He might even love her. He wasn't sure. She was pretty and funny, and up until tonight, he'd thought spiritually minded. But now she had left him with a choice he agonized over for several weeks. In the end, George told Ermengarde he was going to become a missionary, and if she did not want to marry a missionary, then obviously she did not want to marry him. Although it was a difficult decision to come to, George felt better once he had announced it. He began to read every paper and report he could find about missionaries. Soon, much to his delight, he was invited to hear a real missionary speak. The man was Herman Ball, and he came from a wealthy family. Instead of living the kind of rich, lazy life he could have afforded, Herman Ball chose to work in Poland, among the Jews in the ghettos of Warsaw. When George heard Herman Ball speak, he was inspired. He knew exactly what he should do. He should transfer from Hale University to the missionary training school Herr Wagner had told him about. Then he should go off and become a missionary, just like Herman Ball. But first, he needed to tell somebody about this new life and career change. His father. It was now summertime, and the Prussian countryside was in full bloom. As George Muller looked out the coach window, he hardly noticed. He had other things on his mind. He fingered the papers tucked in his coat pocket. He tried to imagine what his father would say when he was asked to sign the papers that would transfer his son to the missionary training school. Surely, he reasoned, his father would not be too upset. After all, George had given up stealing, cheating, and lying. That was something. At least George thought it was. Even the fact that he was asking his father to sign the papers instead of forging his signature, as he usually did, was a sign of a big change in George. Despite this reasoning, George had a gnawing feeling that every crack of the coachman's whip was taking him closer to a confrontation with his father. "You want me to do what?" Johann Muller bellowed, his eyes bulging in frenzied anger. "Have you gone mad? What is wrong with you, boy?" George explained there was nothing wrong with him anymore. In fact, he felt things were more right with him than they had ever been in his entire life. He had stopped drinking, gambling, and partying, all things his father had nagged him with for years. And in their place, he went to church 3 times a week, read his Bible each day, and prayed regularly. On top of all of that, in the past 6 months, he'd pulled his grades up to the highest level. You always wanted me to be a Lutheran pastor. Now I want to be a missionary. That isn't so different. Both are callings that honor God, George added at the end. Honor? Don't talk to me about honor. George could hear his father's voice raising to a dangerous pitch. For a moment he wondered whether he would be beaten as he had been so often as a child. But he was 21 years old now. Surely his father would not beat him. What is the 5th commandment? Tell me that, demanded his father. George sighed. Honor your father and mother, he said, sensing where his father was headed with this line of questioning. Sure enough, Johann Muller thrust his face close to his son's and asked, Did you honor your dear mother? Did you? What about the day she died? When I went to fetch you at Halberstadt, they told me you were at a party, drinking and playing cards. You didn't come home until 2 a.m., and your mother was dead by then. How is that honoring your mother? George could feel his father's hot breath against his cheeks. He did not answer, and Johann Muller left the question hanging in the air for a moment before pressing on. And now, you think you are honoring me with this wild scheme? What will my friends say? Poor Johann Muller, he paid for his son to go to school until he was 21, Hale University no less. A bright lad, too, top of the class. Yes, he was going to be a Lutheran pastor, a good position, with a good salary and respect. And then he threw it all away to become a missionary, with not even a penny in his pocket. Mr. Muller viciously spat out the word missionary. Do you think I invested all of this money in your education so that you could do this to me? God help me, George. I'll disown you if you do this. Then his father did something George would never have predicted. He burst into tears. Don't do this, George, I beg of you. Don't do this. He sobbed deeply as he clung to his son's coat sleeve. George sat on the edge of his chair. He did not know which was worse, his father ranting or his father sobbing. After a minute or so, his father pointed to the door. Go, he gasped between sobs. Get out of my sight. George quietly got up and left the room. The confrontation he'd feared had occurred. Over the next 2 days, George did everything possible to change his father's mind. He knew that unless his father signed the papers, he could not transfer into the missionary training school. Despite his son's best efforts, George's father was unmoved. He made his position perfectly clear to his son. He had spent a lot of money on George's education, and he expected results. Most notably, he wanted to eventually see his son in a good, well-paying position in a Lutheran church. George could not guarantee such a result. He had promised to do whatever God asked of him, and so he could not be bound by his father's wishes. So, on the morning before he was due back at Hale University, George knocked on the library door. Come in, his father said. When he saw that it was George, he added impatiently, Well, what is it? George took a deep breath. I have come to a decision, he said, holding his hands behind his back so his father could not see that they were shaking. So, you've come to your senses at last? Johann Muller growled. Actually, Father, I feel very clear-headed. I have decided that it would be not right for me to take any more of your money, since I cannot guarantee I will do what you want, or that I can pay you back, in kind or in good reputation. George could see his father's face turning bright red, but he could not stop quite yet. Since you will not sign the papers for me to go to the missionary training school, I will remain at Hale until I get my degree. But in so doing, I will not take any more money from you. Not for tuition, not for books, not for food. Not one penny." And then he added boldly, "Ever." Johann Muller looked at his oldest son, narrow, blazing eyes. "So be it," he hissed. "Now get out of my sight." George turned and left the room. As he shut the door behind him, he knew he had closed a door in his life. Whatever his faults, his father had always given him an allowance, bailed him out of jail, and sent extra money when he needed more books. Now he, George Muller, student at University of Halle and soon to be missionary, had shut the door on his father's money now and forever. Later that day, as George sat in the stagecoach rumbling back toward Halle, he felt strangely relieved. The sense of looming confrontation he'd felt on his journey home had been replaced with a sense of expectation. He had given no choice but to cut the ties with his earthly father. Now, all he had was his heavenly Father to provide for him. As the villages and fields slipped by, George wondered how it would all work out. Chapter 4. Too Childish for a Grown Man. George Muller drummed his fingers on his desk. "Money," he mumbled to himself, barely audibly. "I need money." A year ago, he wouldn't have been sitting in his room worrying about money he needed. He would be out doing something about it. There had always been a way to get what he needed. There was always someone he could borrow from, something he could pawn. He could even get lucky playing cards. But not now. Now George was a Christian and would not use any of his old tricks or schemes to raise the money he needed. There had to be some other way, but what was it? He had tried to find work at several of the businesses, but all the jobs had been promised to students long before they left for summer vacation. As he gazed out of the window at the trees now laden with golden leaves, George had a strange idea. At first he resisted it. It was too childish for a grown man and much too simple for a university student. It would be foolish to kneel down and ask God to send him the money he needed. He had never heard of anyone doing that. God wasn't interested in what George Muller ate for dinner, or whether he had textbooks to study from. Or was he? Finally, George decided he would try it anyway. He slipped to his knees and leaned his elbows on the edge of his bed. "Dear God," he began, wondering whether he was making a fool of himself, "you know the situation I'm in, and you know what I need. I ask you to provide for me. Amen." There, he had done it. He stood up and ran his hands through his thick brown hair. Now he would wait and see what happened. An hour later, as George was rewriting some of his lecture notes, he was interrupted by a firm knock at the door. "Come in," he yelled, assuming it to be one of his friends. The door swung open, and standing in the doorway was none other than Dr. Tholuck, Halle University's new professor of divinity. With him, a stranger. George jumped to his feet in astonishment, wondering what on earth the professor was doing at his doorway. He bowed politely, spilling papers everywhere as he did so. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, unsure of what to do next. "Would you like to come in?" George glanced quickly around his room. His books were sprawled out on his bed, and a half-drunk cup of coffee and a trail of crumbs lay on his desk. The two men entered the room. "Thank you," said Dr. Tholuck, who then turned to the stranger and began to speak to him in English. George soon realized why the professor was speaking English. "Dr. Hodge, this is George Muller, the man I told you so much about. George, this is Dr. Hodge from Princeton University in America." Dr. Hodge smiled warmly, but said nothing. George bowed again. He could not think of anything that would cause these two men to be crammed in his tiny little room? I will get straight to the point, Dr. Tholuck went on, clearing his throat. Dr. Hodge and 3 of his colleagues from America have come to visit Hale for a year. They will be attending lectures, and as time goes by, giving them as well. There is just one difficulty. None of them speaks German. Oh, said George, wondering how any of this involved him. Dr. Tholuck smiled. I have been told you speak English well, and that you would make an excellent tutor for our guests. George could feel himself getting flushed. This was the last thing he needed. If he volunteered to help 4 people learn English, he would have no time at all to earn money, even if he did find a job. He had to find a polite way to say no. I am honored, he stammered, reverting back to German, in hopes of not embarrassing Dr. Hodge. It's just that it would be hard for me to find the time. My circumstances have changed a little this year, and I have been forced to look for a job. He smiled, hoping Dr. Tholuck would not be insulted. Why, George, laughed Dr. Tholuck. You don't think I would ask you to do this for nothing, do you? This is a job. I see, said George, with a lot more excitement in his voice. You must discuss the rate with Dr. Hodge. Take the job only if it pays enough, advised Dr. Tholuck. Feeling a little awkward about the situation, George turned to the American. He spoke in English again. I hear you would like me to tutor you in German, he said. Yes, replied Dr. Hodge, with a strong American accent. And if you do it half as well as Professor promises me you will, we'll be glad to pay you twice the going rate. Now let's work out the details, shall we? 15 minutes later, it was all settled. George would tutor the 4 Americans for 8 hours a week. Even though they would come to lessons together, Dr. Hodge insisted they would each be happy to pay him separately and double the normal rate. George's eyes widened as he added it up. This meant he would be getting 8 times as much as a regular tutor would be paid. He tried to protest that it was just too much, but Dr. Hodge just smiled and told him not to worry about it. The money had already been set aside. As George opened the door to bid his guests farewell, Dr. Tholuck turned to him and said, Maybe there's something else you might be interested in, George. Apparently, there's an orphanage across the street. The Frank Orphanage, I believe it's called. Anyway, they have a room set aside for a divinity student. It's nothing fancy, from what I understand, but deserving students are selected to stay there for free for 2 months at a time. Have you heard of it? George nodded. Yes, I have, sir, he replied, recollecting the way he and his friends at the alehouse had made fun of the poor, unfortunate students who'd been forced to stay there. But now, for some reason, it sounded like somewhere he would like to stay. I have to submit a list of names of worthy students. Would you like me to put your name on the list? Asked Dr. Tholuck, looking directly into George's deep blue eyes. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I would be very grateful if you would. I thought you might. From what I've heard, it seems like the kind of thing that you'd be interested in. Well, I must get Dr. Hodge back to his room so he can finish unpacking. Good day to you, George. Nice to meet you, son, said the American, flashing a smile. With that, the 2 men were gone. George walked back to his desk and sat down. He felt like he was in a dream. He pulled his watch from his pocket. It had only been an hour and a half since he'd prayed, and now he had a well-paying job and the possibility of a free room for 2 months. He knelt at his bedside for the 2nd time that afternoon and gave thanks to God. As it turned out, George Muller was the 2nd student to get the use of the room at the orphanage that year. He moved his few belongings up the 5 flights of stairs to the room on the top floor with the dull view of a gray stone building directly across the street. While the view from the room might have been dull, life at the orphanage was certainly lively. George had walked past the orphanage nearly every day since arriving in Hale, but he had no idea how or why it was founded. When he heard the story, he was fascinated by it. Dr. A. H. Frank had been a professor of theology at Hale University 100 years before. Since Dr. Frank was a dedicated Christian, he felt God had called him to help the orphans in the town. With no rich family connections and only a little money of his own, he had managed to scrape together enough to build the 6-story building. From there, he had fed, clothed, and housed and educated 2,000 children. Even now, George was told the orphanage had no regular source of income, and those who ran it relied on God to supply their needs. Because Dr. Frank had been a professor at Hale, he had stated in his will that one room of the orphanage was to be permanently set aside for deserving students to use for free of charge. George was in awe of Dr. Frank's story, which made his prayer asking for enough money to make it through that year seem puny by comparison. He wondered how a person ever got to have faith like Dr. Frank's. While George was staying at the orphanage, he was invited to give his first sermon at a small countryside church. This was an important moment for a divinity student, and George fretted about what he would say. He skimmed through many books, looking for something that sounded grand enough. Once he had selected a passage, he wrote out his sermon, correcting and recorrecting it, trying one word first and then another. Satisfied that he could improve it no more, he submitted it to a professor for approval. Once it was approved, he committed the entire half-hour sermon to memory. He did not want to read it from the page when he delivered it, and he did not want to get caught for a single second without knowing what he was going to say next. Finally, Sunday, August 27th, 1826 arrived. George borrowed a horse and rode out into the countryside to the dot on the map where he was assured there was a church. Sure enough, as he approached the location, there was, nestled among the trees, its bell chiming that it was time for the services to begin. George hurried in and met the elderly pastor. Then he quickly checked out the pulpit to reassure himself that everything was in order. George stood nervously picking at one of his coat buttons as the last strains of the hymn faded. He adjusted the collar of his shirt and stood to speak. As he began excitedly, as he had planned, with growing satisfaction he realized he could recite the sermon perfectly. He put emphasis on the right words and paused just long enough for the right dramatic effect. His voice rose and fell evenly, and by the end of the sermon, he was congratulating himself. It was a near perfect performance. As George stood at the door after the service, shaking hands with the members of the congregation, his attitude quickly changed. The congregation consisted of poor, rural people, mostly farmers. Several of them thanked George for his very fancy sermon. Others laughed and said they couldn't understand a word that he had said. George ate lunch with the elderly pastor of the church. He tried to be polite, but his mind was not really on the conversation. Instead, he was thinking about his sermon, the very sermon a week before he had thought was a brilliantly polished masterpiece. But what had seemed polished and alive to him had been dead and irrelevant to his hearers. George could rationalize that they were just illiterate farmers and unable to grasp the simplest of concepts taught in the university. But he was starting to see things from a different perspective. The purpose of a sermon was not for the preacher to show how many long words he could string together or how many important books he could mention. No, The purpose of a sermon was to instruct people about how to know God, and for that purpose, the simpler it was, the better. By the end of lunch, George had a decision. He was not ever going to preach a sermon like that again. Rather, he was going to preach using simple words and ideas, and he would quote only from the Bible. Later that afternoon, he had a chance to try out his new approach to delivering sermons. He was scheduled to speak at the afternoon service in the church. Originally, he was intended to deliver the same sermon again, but not now. He folded the pages of the sermon and put them back in his pouch. Instead, he pulled out his Bible. "Is there somewhere I could be alone for a few minutes to pray?" he asked politely. The old pastor seemed surprised by the request. "Well, yes, you can stay here if you would like. I always take a stroll in the garden after lunch. I was going to ask you if you would like to join me, but if you'd rather stay here and pray." His voice trailed off. "Thank you," George replied. "I think I need to." When the old pastor had gone, George sank to his knees beside his chair. "Dear God," he prayed, "show me how you want me to say this afternoon." With that, he opened his Bible to the book of Matthew, chapter 5, to the passage he had been reading that morning back at Hale. Before long, some ideas came to him based around the verse, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." George thanked God for his help and stood up. There would be no fancy, high-sounding sermon this afternoon, just a few simple thoughts from the New Testament. That afternoon, the congregation left the church with smiles on their faces. "I think I learned something this afternoon," said one farmer with calloused hands. "You really made me think," said an old woman, her eyes brown and shining. George rode back to Hale a happy man. He had learned a lesson he vowed to never forget. The rest of the year passed quickly for George. He was asked to give more sermons, and he made sure they were always simple messages from his heart. He went to the Bible meetings every Saturday, and on Sunday mornings he would walk 10 or even 15 miles to hear a good preacher. On Sunday evenings, a group of Christian men from Hale met in his room for prayer and hymn singing. Exactly a year after George had delivered his first sermon, a letter addressed to Dr. Tholuck arrived at Hale University from the Continental Missionary Society in England. The letter asked Dr. Tholuck if he had a student he would recommend to be a missionary in the city of Bucharest, in the southeastern Europe. Dr. Tholuck wasted no time in asking George if he was interested. After praying about it, George agreed to fill out the application papers and send them back to London. He felt sure he would get the position because, much to his surprise, his father had agreed to let him go. He saw this as a sign of God's blessing on the endeavor. As George waited for a reply from London, he kept busy with his studies, which included English, Greek, German, French, Latin, and Italian. Along with studying these languages, George felt a need to study Hebrew. He couldn't think of a good reason why he felt this way, since he did not know a single Jewish person. Yet, he bought a Hebrew textbook from which he taught himself the language as best he could. About a month after sending the application papers off to London, George happened to be at a meeting with Dr. Tholuck. As they talked, the professor asked out of the blue, "Have you ever thought about being a missionary to the Jews? I'm an advisor to the London Society of Promoting Christianity Among the Jews. Did you know that?" "No, sir, I did not," replied George, thinking the question odd, since Dr. Tholuck already knew he intended to go to Bucharest. "But it is strange to you that you should ask. I have had a particular desire to study the Hebrew language for a while." "Well, perhaps you should consider it," urged the professor. "I know you want to go to Bucharest, So I suggest you pray and wait. If things work out for you to go to Bucharest, you should take that as God's will for you to go. But if not, perhaps His will is for you to do this work with the Jews." George nodded. He would keep learning Hebrew and wait. As it turned out, he didn't have to wait long. Later that month, he received a letter from the Continental Missionary Society thanking him for his interest in Bucharest. They were sorry to inform him, however, that they were no longer able to send a missionary there. A war between Russia and Turkey was going on in the area, and that made it unsafe for missionary work to proceed. They would, however, keep his application on file in case the situation changed, although they did not think that it was likely to change in the next year or two. As George read the letter, a sense of relief swept over him. God had made His will plain. George was not supposed to go to Bucharest as a missionary after all. George thanked Dr. Tholuck and asked him if he would submit his name to the Missionary Society of Promoting Christianity Among the Jews as a missionary candidate. Dr. Tholuck happily obliged, sending off a letter immediately. Then both men waited and waited and waited some more for a reply. In May 1828, while he was still waiting for a reply, George completed his degree and found a temporary job as a chaplain. Finally, in June, George Muller received his reply. The London Society for Promoting Christianity Among Jews had reviewed Dr. Tholuck's letter and was prepared to offer George a 6-month probationary period in London to start at his convenience. George would spend his time studying the Hebrew language and effective ways of communicating with the Jews. At first, George was upset. He had waited for so long for the reply, and now he was being told he needed to travel all the way to London for 6 more months of study. He had been studying all his life, it seemed. In the end, he took up the offer. After all, it appeared it was God's will for him to do so. In his eagerness to get to London, however, George had overlooked one very important matter. Prussia had an army that was the envy of every other country in Europe. The army had become renowned through its practice of conscription. Prussia was one of the first nations in modern Europe to require all her able-bodied men to serve in the army. Conscripts served for 3 years in the army, although men with a university degree were required to serve only 1 year. There was no way George could be allowed to leave Prussia until he had served his 1 year in the army. The trouble was, he didn't have a year to spare. He wanted to get to London as soon as possible, so he began to pray. Chapter 5. A Free Man. George lay in bed, his head throbbing with pain, and his eyes feeling like 2 burning cinders. He was vaguely aware of a doctor standing over him, pushing and prodding on his abdomen. He winced with pain with each touch. It felt as though the doctor was stabbing him with a knife. George heard the doctor talking to someone else in the room. Was it Betta? He tried to pull all his mental faculties together and concentrate, but he couldn't. He sank back into his pillow as the darkness of unconsciousness overcame him. Several hours later, he awoke. His sheets were drenched with perspiration, and his head still throbbed. He didn't think anyone else was in the room, and he lay quietly wondering whether this was it. Oh, this is how it's going to end. It's no wonder I didn't get an exemption from the army so I could go to England. I wasn't supposed to go anywhere. I'm gonna die here in Prussia. George mumbled to himself, the words barely audible above his shallow breathing. The thought of dying did not scare George. In fact, he felt strangely peaceful and resigned to his fate. It was true he had done all he could do to get out of his army obligations. He had written to explain that he wanted to be a missionary. That did not work. He'd had important officials appeal directly to King Frederick Williams III on his behalf, but the king refused the appeals. In the end, there was no alternative. George was to report for army duty in a month, but now he would be going nowhere. George heard hinges creak and looked over to see Betta silhouetted in the doorway. Betta tiptoed to the bedside. When he saw that George was awake, he smiled. "How are you feeling, my friend?" he asked quietly. "I don't know. Better, I think," replied George, unsure of his condition. "Did the doctor come to see me before?" "Yes," replied Betta, surprised. "You remember?" George tried to nod his head, but it hurt too much. "What did he say?" he asked. "It's not good news, I'm afraid. It seems the illness you have had for the past month made you cough and over-exercise your stomach muscles. The coughing fit caused a blood vessel in your stomach to break. You had been bleeding there for quite some time, the doctor thought." "What happens now?" asked George through cracked lips. "I have some medicine here from the doctor. He said you should take it and rest and pray." Betta lifted an amber-colored bottle from the side table and pulled the cork from its neck. George swallowed a spoonful of the thick black liquid from the bottle before falling back on his pillow. He was exhausted from the effort of leaning forward. Rest and pray. George knew how to do both, but would they be enough? For 5 days, George lay somewhere between life and death. Then, much to the amazement of the doctor, he began to make a slow recovery. A month later, George was well enough to report to the army, or so he thought. As the army doctor examined him, not once but twice, he frowned and asked George a lot of questions about his health. In the end, he shook his head. "It's a sorry thing to have to say to a young lad like you, but it's my opinion you're not well enough to serve in the army. If you waited 10 years, I doubt you'd ever be well enough for the Prussian army. You'll have to be excused." The doctor looked apologetically at George, who was trying to hold back a smile. An army general, no less, signed the papers, and within the space of an hour, George Muller's sickness had made him a free man, able to travel anywhere he wanted. On March 19th, 1829, George stood on the deck of the boat he had boarded in Rotterdam, Holland, for the trip to England. Now, as the boat sailed up the River Thames toward London, George took a deep breath of English air. He had made it! George was eager for the boat to tie up so that he could get on with his training. The sooner he started, the sooner he would be on his way back to mainland Europe as a missionary to the Jews. By the end of his first day in London, George had found himself a room in a cheap boarding house in Hackney, definitely not the fashionable end of London, but it suited his purposes. The next morning, George took a coach to London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews. There he met the director, who explained to him that every detail of his life for the next 6 months had been mapped out for him. For 12 hours a day, he was to study Hebrew, Chaldee, and the rabbinic alphabet. At the end of 6 months, he would be expected to be able to read, write, and speak Hebrew fluently, and to recite from memory many of the chapters from the Old Testament in the original language. When he had proved himself capable of doing this, the society would give him his first missionary assignment, most likely to somewhere in Austria or Russia. George set to work that evening. Even though he had advantage of already knowing a little Hebrew, he was aware that he would have to work hard if he was going to be a missionary at the end of 6 months. George encountered small encouragements along the way. He heard, for instance, of a rich dentist from Exeter in southwest England who had given up his very profitable practice to go to Prussia as a missionary. The dentist, whose name was Anthony Groves, apparently wasn't asking anyone for financial support. He was going to go out as a missionary, trusting God to meet all of his financial needs. He sounded like a man after George's own heart, and George wished he could have met him. But Dr. Groves had already left England, and all George could do was hope that it wouldn't be too long before he followed Groves's example. George was in London for only 2 months before he suffered a setback. The illness that had kept him from the Prussian army flared up again. The doctor who visited him was very alarmed. He felt sure that George was about to die and urged him to get out of the damp, smoky air of London as soon as possible. He told him that his only hope for recovery was to stay at the seaside. George took the doctor's advice, and as soon as he had the strength, he made the coach trip to Teginsmouth in Devon, in southern England. George had no particular reason for choosing Teginsmouth, other than it had a mild climate and bracing sea air. But while he was there, he encountered circumstances that would change the course of his life. While in Teginsmouth, George Muller had met a Scotsman named Henry Craik. Henry was the same age as George, and like George, was a university graduate who had become a Christian during his college years. Also like George, Henry Craik had worked as a tutor, not for adults though, but for children. George was astonished to learn that the children whom Henry had tutored were the children of Anthony Groves, the dentist and now missionary George had heard about in London. Of course, George wanted to know all about Anthony Groves, and Henry Craik, who was very impressed with his old employer, was glad to share what he knew. He told George that Anthony Groves had become involved with a group of influential Christian men whom he encountered while studying in Dublin, Ireland. The men, who were all graduates of top colleges, including in their ranks the sons of an Irish member of Parliament, a baron, a lord, and the godson of Admiral Nelson. The men had begun meeting together to discuss their Christian beliefs. After studying the Bible, they came to the conclusion that it was indeed true, and that they should follow it exactly. This led Anthony Groves to give 10% of his income to the poor. Then he upped it to a quarter. And finally he began to give away all his income, except for a small amount to cover day-to-day needs of his family. Ultimately, Groves decided to sell all that he had and become a missionary. The other members of the group made similar decisions. One of them, Benjamin Newton, had begun to hold Christian meetings in Plymouth, near the southwestern tip of England, where he was enjoying great success. The meetings were open to believers of all denominations, and were now being called the Plymouth Brethren Meetings. George was fascinated by all he heard. He wished he could meet some of these men. If they had had the kind of impact on Anthony Groves' life as Henry Craik seemed to indicate, they were people George wanted to know. For 10 days George stayed in Teginsmouth. He would not allow himself to stay any longer, because he had to make up for lost time in his Hebrew lessons. As his health improved, his strength returned, as he was more anxious than ever to get on with the task of becoming a missionary. Although George returned to London feeling physically stronger than he had felt in a long time, something else about him had changed. George had a new mission. He had been inspired by Henry Craik's description of Anthony Groves and the Plymouth Brethren. George promised himself that he would stop reading books about the Bible, and instead, He would only read the Bible itself, from cover to cover. And when he had read through the Bible completely, he would start at the beginning and read it again. The more George read the Bible, the more he wanted to get started doing something right now. He didn't want to wait until he was sent out by the Missionary Society. George organized a prayer meeting in his room each evening from 6 until 8. He invited his fellow students, many of whom came to the meetings. But this wasn't enough for George. Why, he asked himself, should he wait until he got to Europe to preach to the Jews? There were thousands of Jews right here in London. George took to the streets of London, his pockets stuffed with tracts, each of them having his name and address carefully written on it. He headed for the street corners where he had seen Jewish men gather. Sometimes he preached to the men assembled there. Sometimes he read from the New Testament to the small boys who crowded around him. And sometimes he handed out tracts inviting people to visit him. As he did this, George began to notice something. Not something unusual, but something so obvious he had missed it all along. As he spoke to the Jews, hundreds of non-Jewish people hurried by him, but many of these people needed to hear the gospel message as much as the Jews did. A desire to talk to people of all religions and faiths about God began to grow in George. It was desire that would not go away. George began to wonder whether it was right for him to continue his involvement with the London Society for Promoting Christianity among the Jews. He no longer wanted to go to Europe to work only among the Jews. He wanted to stay right here in England and preach to anyone who would listen. On New Year's Day, 1830, he made up his mind. He wrote a letter to the members of the Missionary Society, thanking them for their help and support, but asking to be released from their program because he no longer felt sure that God wanted him to return to Europe to preach only to the Jewish people. On January 27th, the board of the society met to consider George Muller's request. Disappointed, they finally agreed to release from their program one of the best students they'd ever had. George was now a free man, a foreigner, with nowhere to go, no missionary society to back him, no job, and only a £5 note in his pocket. He could not have been happier.